Yes, this is part 2 of chapter 2. I'd like to back up a minute and clear some things up from the very end of part 1. The proponents of the Constitution called themselves the Federalists, though sometimes we call them the Nationalists. The opponents were the Anti-Federalists, or the states' writers. The Constitution that we had now had to be approved at ratifying conventions in at least 9 states. That was probably the most democratic feature of the Constitution. It did not have to be accepted by the existing Congress, nor that it had to be accepted by the state, by the specific people had to vote on it within the states. It had to be ratified by the state legislatures. Remember that the Anti-Federalists could offer no agreed-upon alternative to the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalist view was a favoring of a weaker national government. They believed that liberty could be secured only in small republics. Otherwise, national government would be distant from the people, becoming tyrannical. Strong national government would use powers to annihilate state functions. They thought the nation needed at best a loose confederation of states, with most of the power wielded by the state legislatures, and we know from the Articles of Confederation that that had not worked. If there was a strong national government, they believed, there should be many more restrictions on it. Madison's response really is in Federalist number 10 and 51. He believed that or his answer to his critics, he believed, was that he argued just quite the opposite, that liberty is safest in large, or as he put it, extended republics. In a small community, he said, there will be relatively few differences in opinion or interest. People will tend to see the world in much the same way. If anyone dissents or pursues an individual interest, he or she will be confronted by a massive majority and will have few, if any, allies. But in a large republic, there will be many opinions and interests. As a result, it will be hard for a tyrannical majority to form or organize, and anyone with an unpopular view will find it easier to acquire allies. If Madison's argument seems strange, ask yourself the following question. If I have an unpopular opinion, an exotic lifestyle, or an unconventional interest, will I find greater security living in a small town or a big city? By favoring a large republic, Madison was not trying to stifle democracy. Rather, he was attempting to show how democratic government really works and what can make it work better. To rule different interests must come together and form a coalition, that is, an alliance. In Federalist 51, he argued that the coalitions that formed in a large republic would be more moderate than those that formed in a small one, because the bigger the republic, the greater the variety of interests, and thus the more a coalition of the majority would have to accommodate a diversity of interests and opinions if it hoped to succeed. He concluded that in a nation the size of the United States, with its enormous variety of interests, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good. Whether he was right in that prediction is a matter to which we shall return repeatedly. This was a daring implication, these arguments. He was suggesting that the national government should be at some distance from the people and insulated from their momentary passions, because the people did not always want to do the right thing. Liberty was threatened as much by public passions and popularly based factions as by strong governments. Now, the Anti-Federalists had no very lofty view of human nature, as is evidenced by the deep suspicion with which they viewed power-seeking people. What Madison did was take this view to its logical conclusion, arguing that if people could be corrupted by office, they could also be corrupted by factional self-interest. Thus, the government had to be designed to prevent both the politicians and the people from using it for ill-considered or unjust purposes. Now, I just spent that last bit, okay, basically reading to you page 33 in your textbook. It's an extremely important section, and I will tell you to take heed of that, okay, as you are studying. So remember this. The Federalist counter-argument to the objections of the Anti-Federalists included 1. A focus on representative over direct democracy, and 2. The development of a large, diverse republic rather than a small, concentrated one, so that diverse economic and cultural interests would mitigate or lessen against the formation of homogeneous and potentially tyrannical majorities. Well, what about the Bill of Rights? Well, there were some reasons for the absence of a Bill of Rights. There were several guarantees that were already in the Constitution. The right of habeas corpus, and all of these are defined for you on page 36 of your textbook. No bill of attainder, no ex post facto law, trial by jury in criminal cases, citizens of each state guaranteed the privileges and immunities of citizens of every other state, no religious tests for federal office, no state could pass a law impairing the obligation of contracts. Most states already in and of themselves had bills of rights in their own constitution. The intent in writing the Constitution was to limit federal government to specific powers, but they did concede that they did need a Bill of Rights. They felt that ratification was impossible without one. The Anti-Federalists did. The promise by key leaders to obtain one was not necessarily enough, but it was what they had to go with. There was still a bitter struggle for ratification even without the Bill of Rights. It was narrowly successful. Eventually, 12 amendments were approved by Congress. 10 were ratified by the states and went into effect in 1791 as the Bill of Rights. Those amendments are listed for you on page 37. Okay, and I suggest that you know them. Eventually, you will need to know all 27. Well, what about the Constitution and slavery? Well, slavery was addressed in 3 provisions of the Constitution. 1, House of Representatives apportionment. It was addressed in the 3/5 compromise provision. Secondly, there was also a section that Congress could not prohibit slave trade before 1808, so that there was about 20 years that the slave owners or the South had to acquire from abroad, and Congress after that could end importation, right, making the South accountable at that point in time. And also the Fugitive Slave Clause. If you had an escaped slave and they fled to a non-slave state, the slave had to be returned. So we see a huge compromise that the framers made with slavery. Your book quotes political scientist Theodore Lowy. He calls this the greatest compromise. All right, the way that slavery is dealt with at this point in time. Keep in mind that the Constitution would not have been ratified, and slavery would have continued under the Articles of Confederation with no prospective challenge possible if there had not been a compromise. Okay, our legacy for that will be the Civil War and social and political catastrophe thereafter in the Reconstruction and the Jim Crow period. So what about the motives of the framers? Economic interests at the convention played a modest role in the framers' deliberations because the economic interests of the framers varied widely. Charles Beard, a known historian, said, "Those who supported the Constitution were expected to benefit economically from it. However, the economic interests of the framers themselves did not dominate the convention. In 1950, there was a political scientist that counteracted that theory and said there really was no clear division along the class lines that had been found by the historians in the 50s. More recent research in the 1980s suggests that state economic considerations outweighed personal considerations. Excluding the grave and enormous exception of slaveholders, most delegates who voted to ratify the Constitution were not motivated by economic interests. Economic interests played a larger role in state ratifying conventions. All right. They were more likely to vote in favor of ratification, or the groups that were more likely to vote in favor of ratification were the merchants, urban owners of Western lands, holders of government IOUs, and non-slave owners. Those less likely to vote in favor of ratification would have been the farmers, non-holders of government IOUs, and the slave owners. In discussing the Constitution and equality, we have some contemporary critics. They say the government today is too weak. They claim that that is today's defect. That it bows to special interests that foster economic inequality, and that national government does not resist special interest. That the changing views of liberty and equality are reflected in this criticism. They claim that special interests perpetuate social inequality. The framers were more concerned with political inequality. They wanted to guard against political privilege. Today, the inequality is not viewed the same way. The belief is that there is a national social order that is made up in the marketplace and those operating in the marketplace, and that leads to undesirable inequalities, especially in economic power. The critics believe the government should have the power to restrain these natural tendencies and produce by law a greater degree of equality than society allows when left alone. For the framers, it was liberty and political equality. All right. Liberty and political equality were not in conflict, but today the critics believe that they are deeply in conflict. I refer you to page 42 in your textbook. The proposed remedy that some of the critics have come up with is that the president should be more powerful and held accountable to the voters. And that is to allow the government to be more proactive and decisive, allow Congress members to serve concurrently in cabinet, allow the president to dissolve Congress and call for a special election, empower Congress to call for a special presidential election before the end of a president's term when the president has lost the nation's confidence, require presidential and congressional candidates to run as a team in each congressional district, establish a 6-year term for president, lengthen terms in House to 4 years so elections would be concurrent with the presidential election. This remains to be seen whether this could be a workable solution. Results are uncertain. Could we be worse from these reforms? That's a question that needs to be asked. There is also a proposal to make the government less democratic. The government does too much and not too little. And that would be to adopt a new line item veto proposal that would address constitutional concerns by requiring Congress to approve presidential cuts with a fast-track majority vote and to limit the authority of the federal courts. Changes unworkable or open to evasion. Who is right? Constitution not based on abstract reasoning or unproven factual arguments. The crucial questions to ask when considering constitutional reform is, how well has it worked in history, and how well has it worked compared with the constitutions of other democratic nations? That's the end of the chapter. Please look at page 41 and page 43.